Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Ontological Shock. I'm your host, and we're here today to discuss the spiritual ramifications of the UFO and close encounter phenomena. A lesser known aspect of this phenomena throughout its history is that some of the people who report experiences with non human intelligence have reported experiences and convictions that they have received personal communications or expanded understanding or visions that pertain to the evolution of human consciousness, the human future, and so on and so forth. And we're here today to talk about that subject.
Well, okay. I think maybe to make a start here on an exploration of the subject is to deal first and foremost with the issue of the credibility of the claims that emerge in this field.
Sure. I mean, it's definitely the case that the UFO phenomena and everything associated with it is outside the domain of what's normally culturally acceptable. And, you know, it's something that most people aren't immediately aware of. And if they are, they probably take a sort of sideways glance at it. And when you get into the spiritual dimensions of it, then it's even more obscure and even more challenging to people's sense of skepticism. But maybe we can bear some of that out.
Sure. I think also what we need to remember here is because of the um, extraordinary consequences of these ideas entering the mainstream, it is reasonable to expect is that there have been ongoing efforts by various governmental and non-governmental bodies to present the subject in manners which may betray the truth and actuality of what is occurring. In other words, there is a front being presented or a narrative that is being generated in order to serve particular political and governmental goals we just can't see. We should note, maybe at the very outset, that our conversation here, in a way, is timely. In the 70 years of ufology, um, if we take as if we take the Roswell incident as the beginning of modern ufology, we've never been at this point where the United States government, for instance, has acknowledged that there is the possibility of an extraterrestrial presence here. That acknowledgement occurred in December of last year with the admission of the existence of the Advanced Aeronautic Threat Identification Program, which had been generated by various aircraft, United States aircraft, which showed the maneuvering of unidentified craft, which seemed to be of non human origin. So, what we are seeing is the unfoldment of a narrative which does admit that their presence is here. But I think with our conversation here, what we're trying to do is to speak past that presentation and try and look at the reality as has been presented by an enormous number of self proclaimed and identified contactees and abductees. And rather than simply deal with that issue of, well, are they here? I suppose we're just going to look past that point. We accept the fact that they are here, and now we're trying to just focus on what it is they're trying to tell us.
Yeah, and it's a very widespread aspect of the reported experiences. And I'll just cite as an example uh, for us to sort of kick off on. I- In the UFO literature, there are different camps, there are different schools of thought. On the one hand, you have some researchers who are more friendly to the implications of all of this for consciousness and so on, like, for example, John Mack. On the other hand, you have researchers who take the view that the extraterrestrial presence is purely malign, and if not malign, then certainly not good, neutral as far as we're concerned, but serving its own purposes. But I find it interesting that even David Jacobs, who is effectively the greatest living voice for the view that these entities are simply exploiting the human race, even in his books, you find that he reports that people are having these experiences, and they're receiving warnings about nuclear and environmental devastation, and they're having a sense of getting spiritual direction. However, Jacobs tries to write this off as mind control on the part of the aliens, or I guess you could call it a way to generate complicity in what they're trying to do. Uh, my point is that even among those researchers who would like to write this aspect of the phenomena out of our account, it still shows up, and they have to find some kind of internal justification for saying why it's not actually important.
Yeah, and I think it's good to highlight someone like David Jacobs as a representative of a fairly central perspective in this subject, and that is the idea that the extraterrestrials are of some some sort of threat to humanity, and they have designs which are selfish and self-serving and injurious, and ultimately will prove injurious to humanity. That view, incidentally, is quite widespread, and that is worth noting in any discussion here. You could add to David Jacobs the likes of Timothy Good, who in his last book, Alien Enterprise, concludes with a revelation or a report from what he described as a highly placed source inside the United States government, which informed him that, to their knowledge, the extraterrestrials were engaged in a program of hybridization with the view of ultimately displacing and replacing humanity on this planet. And this is a plan that has been decades in the execution, and it is supposedly meant to reach a fulfillment sometime this century. Alongside that fantastic claim, you know, you would have to array the repeated reports or claims from Linda Moulton Howe's contacts. She has, in her work over the last 10, 20 years, has shared a number of accounts, again from unknown, undeclared insiders who present a particularly dark view of the phenomenon. She, of particular interest here when we look at the spiritual aspect of this, she reported about the Collins Elite, which was a self-named group within the US government who was exploring this subject and came to the conclusion that the extraterrestrial phenomenon was but a front for a demonic intrusion into our world.
Sure. And let's not forget that behind the disclosures that occurred in December of last year, we have Tom DeLong, who himself takes an extremely dark view of the nature of this phenomena. Even in the press release where they announced the initiative that resulted in the New York Times piece and so on and so forth, DeLong intimated that there were terrible truths behind all of this that were so horrible the general public should never ever know. So consistently, we have this theme where deep government insiders take the view and promote the idea that this is really ultimately something that's adverse and fundamentally antagonistic toward the sort of human future that we would like.
Yeah, it is. It's a very interesting question, and it's one I often think is answered by such insiders on the basis of almost a precautionary principle. that what is happening is that there's an attempt to examine an elusive phenomenon. And in doing so, they will, at a minimum, notice that the phenomenon is largely indifferent to the day to day living of human society. There's no attempt, excuse me, there's no obvious attempt by extraterrestrials to save humanity from itself. You'd almost have to wonder that is that then interpreted as hostility? If you can imagine a situation that if someone is to stand by and watch somebody drown, it's not unreasonable to assume that that person has some animus to the person who's drowning. Moreover, if they're in the face of an overwhelming force, which they would obviously be, you'd have to think that these government insiders would um, immediately move towards a defensive posture in the expectation that that force would be leveled against them. Also note things worth noting is something that Linda Moulton Howe reported is that there were a number of governmental efforts to communicate with various extraterrestrial groups which failed. There was one report in particular which I found quite credible. It was with supposedly a representative of the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, where he reported to her that he had been part of a team which was examining the breaking of a dam in Arizona. And the dam had been broken as they learned by the group they called the Swedes or Nordics, whatever term they applied there. In this account, what was especially interesting was the fact is that they were able to learn of this action by the Ebens or the Greys, who they were able to communicate with. So, in this sort of instance, may point to something which is maybe at the heart of the experience of insiders dealing with this is ambiguity, the intense enigmatic nature of that which they would look at. And given that there is ambiguous, the phenomenon as a whole is ambiguous, then their motive is ambiguous, and that itself then would demand defensive postures, if not actual aggressive action towards them.
Sure. I mean, and it's understandable on the basis of how the sort of deep state security culture actually functions. Uh, at the risk of oversimplifying, you could say that there's a lot of overlap between the concept of security and the concept of control. And you can never be secure enough. Theoretically, being maximally secure is an asymptote that you can never actually reach. And because of that, you can never actually control enough as far as these institutions are concerned. So, this being a phenomena that's entirely outside of their control, it's natural in a sense for them to suppose that it is the ultimate threat. Um, I don't think it's fully justified, and I don't, and I think, as we've been suggesting, there's a significant amount of deliberate spin being put into it. Not that there aren't reasons for concerns, and not that this isn't a very complex phenomena, and not that it doesn't have some potentially alarming dimensions. Um, but maybe we could take a different tack and start trying to get into the substance of the conversation. Um, by first of all addressing who these beings actually are, or how we can begin to approach that question.
Well, this does raise the issue of the identity of localized consciousness. So, in a way, what if you were to look at this subject from a certain perspective, you could arrive at the conclusion that they too are strangers in a strange land, to use the biblical phrase. That, as has been said, that our identity is not that we are humans who have spiritual experiences, but instead we're spiritual beings having a human experience. That could be true of of these others as well. And this then would suggest is that there is a very powerful point of commonality a shared identity between us and them. But that fact is obscured by our own Western materialist cultural blindness to to our own actual spiritual identity, our own non-physical identity.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, effectively, for the whole modern period, it's been an experiment in secularism and materialism. And we expect that if there were an extraterrestrial presence, that it would be even further down the track of a materialistic ontology. Uh, However, that's not what we actually encounter. These beings exhibit abilities like telepathy and telekinesis. They're able to project and receive thought. So already there, you have a challenge to some of the default assumptions of the materialistic worldview. And as Grant Cameron points out, there are a lot of deep insiders who say that when you really penetrate into the heart of this subject, what you find is that it's ultimately about consciousness, that these beings aren't finally material at all.
No, and that is, I mean, the significance of consciousness and its centrality to this subject is something many have claimed, including Stephen Greer. He has repeatedly says that at the heart of this, we're looking at the power of the human mind, and uh, the fact that we are in a culture which is blind to our ultimate nature. Um, in a way, it closes us off from actually being more readily able to understand these beings. I think it is important to notice that as diverse as the phenomena is in terms of the creatures that people have claimed to have interacted with, what you talk about in terms of telepathy, radical empathy, effect on consciousness, this is something that's experienced in dealings with a whole range of these creatures, from the greys or human-like beings, insect-like beings, reptile-like beings. They all have this particular expression of consciousness, which is, although it's generally unknown to our culture, it is not unknown, say, to the spiritual cultures of the East. Telepathy, even some of this, more extraordinary psychic feats that have been reported by contactees and abductees. Those sort of feats have been demonstrated in these Eastern spiritual cultures.
Certainly. And there's been an increasing amount of scientific verification of the utility of practices like meditation. And that has been very widely publicized. And meditative discipline is something that over the past couple decades has become increasingly normalized in corporate settings and clinical settings and educational settings. And in parallel with that, although to a much lesser known extent, the findings of parapsychology have gotten more and more empirical support. Even mainstream psychology textbooks have had to acknowledge that there may be some unaccounted for phenomena uh, suggested by those sorts of experiments. And personally, I take the view that there there's a very strong analogy between the situation in physics at the end of the 19th century and where we're at with our overall ontology now. And what I'm referring to is the famous quote from Lord Kelvin, where he had said that there were only two small clouds hovering on the horizon of physics. And when those tiny matters were dealt with, then, the whole thing would be wrapped up with a neat bow and physical theory would be basically complete, and everything that remained after that would be a matter of just filling in the details. I think that analogously, there are two clouds on the horizon now, and one of those is the UFO phenomena, and the other of those is the data of parapsychology. And obviously, unlike the other clouds, these aren't things that are taken as serious problems by the mainstream scientific community. But, you know, the UFO phenomena suggests that it's either possible to travel between dimensions or at hyperluminal velocities or in time or possibly all of the above. It suggests, as we've noted, that it's possible for telepathy and telekinesis and whatnot. And parapsychology suggests that these abilities are possible for the human organism to achieve as well. So, really, what we're going to find as people start getting more into this is that their whole metaphysical worldview needs to expand in order to face what we're actually being confronted with.
Well, yeah, it's. I think that it's worth, detailing. I mean, what are maybe some of the specific lessons and ideas that people have picked up through the various forms of contact with this phenomenon.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it goes back through the whole history of it. I mean, people have always reported, for example, receiving warnings about nuclear devastation, environmental disintegration. This is part of the contactee literature. This is part of the abduction literature. As a matter of fact, it might be the one narrative thread that unites every variation on the close encounter experience.
Yeah, and what is interesting about it too is that the nature of the warnings about either war or to the environment or with overpopulation are often pictorial in form. It's through images, ideas are transmitted. And something that is apparent in the literature is that these warnings are given to people regardless of age or social standing or educational background. You can think of, for instance, the school children at the aerial school in Zimbabwe. These are children who are who are 7, 8, 9 years old, and many of them reported is that the beings put images in their mind of trees being cut down and forests being lost, and how all of this was a terrible thing. And you find that, of course, even those sort of ideas repeated in accounts such as that found in John Mack's book, Abducted, where there are abductees of with some significant educational background and they're mature and they receive the same lessons in the same fashion. Alongside this, he more dramatically was an account by a New Zealand abductee, and she reported being brought to a locale with hundreds of other human beings, and they were shown a whole series of images, one after the other, and again all on this theme. So it's something that's there. In the literature from the very beginning, going right back to the contactees of the 1950s, warnings about nuclear war, about the environment, about population, um, have been there. I think if we are to believe sort of researchers like Candy Smith, there has been a change in that there is now amongst abductees, contactees, and in these reports, there's a very powerful sense of imminence that these events are at hand. It's not something that is to unfold in an undeclared future.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this, in that these beings communicate via these images and via this kind of suggestion, is that it's not a discourse per se. It's not you know delivered in bullet points with a series of specific recommendations of how you should respond to these warnings. So there's an open endedness to it for how we're to sort of integrate it, how we're supposed to sort of take action. And that's very consistent as well. This freedom that they're leaving us with for how to respond to these lessons as we will,
And of course, I mean, the freedom is even there in the first step. We're free to interpret it as we will.
or to believe it. Whether, you know,
Yeah.
there seems to be a concern with the integrity of our culture. There's something that's oft repeated in the counterculture of people who take this sort of stuff seriously, which is the analogy of the uncontacted tribe. And a lot of the time, what we find is that when an uncontacted tribe comes into contact with a technological civilization, then their culture begins to disintegrate. They lose their own historical momentum, in part because they become fixated on the technological capacities of the new culture, and in part because of, elementary things like disease immunity and so on. Uh, but it could be that these beings are concerned with the integrity of our culture's own individual historical momentum, and that there's something vital to the experience of a community of sentient beings that has to do with them determining their own destiny and shaping their own world. So it's interesting and it's very suggestive that these beings are taking a kind of peripheral approach to seeding these perspectives, almost as if they're supposed to go into the collective unconscious and then fruition organically.
Oh, yeah. It's it is this concern for the integrity of the culture is probably it's valid. It's something that was picked up on by I think the researchers at, I believe it was the Brookings Institute or the Brookings Report sometime in the 1950s, where this danger inherent to a less advanced culture on contact with a more advanced culture. And they highlighted this and they noted the human experience of such, giving examples, I think, of the contact of European peoples with the various natives of the Americas or Africa or Asia, where catastrophic damage was inflicted on those native cultures for the reasons you outline. Um, there's that concern. Do the extraterrestrials have this concern? Well, some, as you know, some people in the field, such as Whitley Strieber, have related that more or less, yeah, this is a conscious concern of them. He does, of course, quote the Tao Te Ching, where he says, "When the master's best work is done, the people say we did it ourselves." So this points to their aspiration to be hidden and guiding agent here. It's worth noting, I think, that in all these warnings about nuclear war, the environment, what we do not find is anything there that we don't know already. There's nothing there in particular that was unknown to human culture. Um, I note that I cannot think of any particular prediction for the human future that has been borne out. I can't think of anyone who's made claims as a contactee or an abductee for the human future and then had those claims were retrospectively uh, demonstrated and proven. The most prominent figure who's made such a claim has been Stephen Greer, but he didn't publicize ahead of the events that he was told these things would unfold. But generally, as a rule, as I said, we have people are told nothing they didn't know already. There is no dates are shared and no actual precise predictions are made in the main. And there have been no, even where there does seem to be lessons shared, for example, with the question of spirituality, there is an important point to note is that even when spiritual lessons are given, the ideas can be readily understood by the student, but their understanding requires the application of the will. So again, people are free in the response to those teachings.
Yeah, and that brings us to the question of maybe we could sort of hone down and specify what are the spiritual teachings that people are getting from this. How is it that they do impart this sort of information? Where is it sort of going?
Well, I think it's when we look at this, it's important to use an idea that Jacob Needleman introduced in his discussion of the Gurdjieff work, where he emphasizes how critical it is to understand the difference between the ideas and the actual practice of the ideas does not necessarily obtain in a conceptually crisp way. So when we're looking at the spiritual teachings of the extraterrestrials and how did they teach us, these questions, the answers to these questions need to be explored in a way simultaneously. Ultimately, it has to be stated there is no objective spiritual science being shared with us, something that's codified and translatable. There is no extraterrestrial Bible. There have been, say, some groups have claimed such, but generally we don't see across a phenomenon the same sort of set or table of ideas or practices being suggested. And nor should we expect that to quote T.S. Eliot. I mean, he did write, "We think of the key each in in his prison." That what we would expect of a genuine effort to teach us spiritually is that it would be extremely diverse in form, very much tailored to their specific general and particular audiences.
Yeah, for sure. As you know, there is a very uh, individual element to this. Uh, you know, it's worth noting that these beings approach people as individuals. Throughout the literature on the subject, people are confronted by these beings alone. They're taken from their home in the case of abduction. They're confronted, in a natural setting. I mean, there are exceptions, like the case of the school children that you mentioned earlier. But on the whole, they're dealt with as individuals. And some people have suggested that the reason for this is sort of in line with what Nietzsche suggested. To paraphrase, uh, you know, the default state of a group is a kind of insanity, and perhaps these beings have found that if they address us as a culture, as a society, we respond pathologically. Or maybe it has more to do with a sense that the ultimate real unit of the human condition is the individual. But, or it could just be a pragmatic thing. The information that's going to be efficacious for any given person is going to be unique unto themselves.
It's a good point, and it's a good point, and it speaks to the ideas that human intelligence is inversely related to the number of people concentrated in a group. So, one person can be a genius, two people can have a creative partnership, all the way down to a crowd in a sports stadium or, moronic and animal-like. There is something to that idea, certainly, and it would speak to the importance and significance of the fact that the contact is by and large with individuals, although there are significant differences. I think here, though, it would be important for us to maybe just give even a provisional and brief definition of what we mean by spirituality, because I think this is an idea that is, or a concept that's easily and lazily confused with, say, morality or ethics.
Yeah, that's true. And the concept of what spirituality even is kind of hard to pin down. I mean, on one level, you could say that it has to do with the actualization of one's own potential as a conscious being. You could say that it has to do with the transformation of one's awareness, one's personality, one's state of mind, attaining non ordinary states, becoming liberated from certain aspects of reality or certain aspects of the human condition. Uh, the way people generally tend to use the word is kind of vague, and it has more to do with a certain set of values uh, or an effort to live life meaningfully. Um, what's your take on it?
Well, yeah, I mean, what you say there is true. Is that it even typically in casual use when people talk about spirituality or their own spiritual life, they're talking about some sort of ill-defined grasping and finding of meaning in the living of their life. I think that a more accurate and useful definition would need to reflect the what the spiritual traditions themselves say, and whether it's Buddhism or even Christianity in its esoteric form, it does involve this apprehension of non typical states and energies. That is the purpose of the spiritual process. That's what gives it a direction, in that what we take to be known can change, and we can know things we would not otherwise know, if we want to just put it that simply. I think that that's as simple as that formulation is. It is accurate. And if we take that as our definition, we do find in the literature a large amount of effort by these extraterrestrials to give spiritual teachings. Um, Now, why they would do so, I think that's a separate question we can explore later.
Sure. And it's something that's littered throughout more conventional religious literature too. I mean, you have a lot of different mainstream and lesser known spiritual teachers who allude to experiences that could be interpreted as extraterrestrial or that are explicitly extraterrestrial.
Oh, that's an excellent point. I mean, it's worth highlighting that even within our culture and our cultures, aspects of human thinking here have reflected um, a knowledge or reflected a belief in extraterrestrials as extraterrestrials, and we can see this in some traditions such as Mormonism, which famously points to the idea, to the purpose of human evolution, where the human evolves to live on another world, will become in fact the god of another world. We see also in Zargen, which is an aspect of Tibetan Buddhism, we find there the claim that it is the teaching in a number of star systems, not just here. And also Gurdjieff, in his teaching, introduced into the West in the early part of the last century, does talk about extraterrestrials, and it does talk about he even in one teaching he invites his audience to imagine that there are in other worlds three brain beings like us, but who formulate their approach to life differently. So we do find here in our spiritual teachings um, a particular reference to extraterrestrials and enigmatic references to extraterrestrials, and that's not even to mention the possibility that angelic reference in the Bible is in fact reference to extraterrestrials.
Yeah, if you think about it, anytime an angel appears in the Old Testament, the first thing they always say is, "Fear not." And I think that's very indicative because obviously in the close encounter literature, what we find with the Greys especially is that when people come into contact with these beings, when they're physically present, there's an overwhelming sense of fear. Some people have suggested that the reason for that is that there's a physiological response to beings that aren't part of our same phylogenetic tree, and that we're sort of freaking out on a cellular level. Others have suggested that to be in the presence of an entity which is not constrained by space time and dimensionality in the way that we are is intrinsically terrifying. It's to feel perhaps exposed, vulnerable, transparent in ways that most people don't have any conscious precedent for.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in and of itself to talk about that experience of fear people have had in the presence of extraterrestrials. Again, can make reference to one particular case, and again, it's the case of this unidentified member of the Air Force's Office of Special Investigation. This gentleman remarked that on p- preceding his first contact with an extraterrestrial, in this case, a gray, he was warned repeatedly that he needed to brace himself in the face of this contact, that he was warned he would experience a level of fear, an unprecedented level of fear that he would barely be able to manage. He scoffed at this idea. He reported he was a combat veteran and imagined himself as tough and robust. He reported that he experienced fear as he was told he would experience it. He compared it, in fact, I think, to facing a flamethrower, ready and it was pointed at him. And he was at a loss to explain um, he had this level of fear. I think I think there's something we can see in our spiritual literature which might point to the nature of this fear, this extraordinary fear. And that is when a number of people have been introduced into higher states of consciousness by their teachers in some sort of artificial, synthetic way, is that they have asked after some time that this stops, they're asked to be returned to their previous state. And this may simply be a result of, I think, that the certain states of consciousness or states of consciousness make a particular demand of our physiology, of our vital energies, our vital capacities in some way. And that when we experience a higher consciousness, there's a far greater demand being made of the body. I think it's possible that when we're dealing with certain of these extraterrestrials, is that the the gap and the distance between us and them is such that that our presence in their our presence and the force of their consciousness begins to exact what could prove to be a deadly demand of our body, and instinctually we attempt to retreat from that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a sound interpretation. And I think the story you were just talking about is that the Bill Hamilton
No,
story?
this is from Linda Moulton Howe. It's She reported that when I may have some of the essential details slightly wrong here, but I believe it was she was working for NBC. She was creating a documentary on the animal mutilations. She reported that she was approached as she waited, as she was just approached in public by this gentleman who made this claim that he was had been with this Air Force office, and they were involved in the investigation of the phenomenon, including the mutilations. And he shared with her a number of things, but he did, as I said, he mentioned this the fact that they had no idea what the Swedes, as they call them, they had no idea what they were doing. They'd never been able to establish contact with them. that they had communication with the Greys or Ebens, as they call them, the the blondes. They were under the they had the impression that they had whatever it was they did, they always acted with a purpose. And then he had an encounter with a grey being who incidentally floated towards him. He almost passed out. It was an extremely demanding experience for him. And then just to complete that account, he said that once his consciousness engaged with these extraterrestrial beings and engaged on the moment they shared a gaze, the being raised its head, and once they locked eyes, then there seemed to be an extraordinary energetic exchange where he described it as if there were seven movies, I believe, opened up in his mind where there was a sharing of knowledge. And he said it was as if it could anticipate his questions and begin to answer them before he would even formulate them. He had a sense overall of their purpose and their mission here, but he said once he was released from that state, he was unable to translate it and present it in any meaningful sense. He was left, as many people are, with an impression of their extraordinary power, and he incidentally introduced. It's in that report you find the idea of where he mocks the claim that they're going to sit down over a cup of coffee and explain the meaning of the universe to us.
Something that I find interesting about that particular story, in the midst of these 7 or 12 or however many simultaneous multidimensional movie recordings that the individual says were playing in their mind, transmitted from this Eben. Um, I believe they reported seeing sort of three-dimensional golden letters,
That's right.
sort of interspersed with these multidimensional sort of temporal unfoldings. These I guess you could think of them as parallel quantum realities or whatever they are. I mean, but what I'm getting at is there's an interesting coincidence in the phenomenology of a lot of this contact stuff and a lot of old religious literature. Specifically, these golden letters from the story we're talking about. And for example, Tsongkhapa, who founded the Gelug lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, who saw characters, floating around him that match the ones in this description of this telepathic link up with this Eben very precisely. And Tsongkhapa reports seeing these characters floating in visionary and physical space for a number of months as he was carrying out some of the work that was central to his own spiritual development. And it's just a kind of passing throwaway example, but I think that what we're going to find, and obviously there's already been a lot of good work done on this, but what we're going to find as this becomes normalized and as more serious work is done on the subject is that there's a continuity in the phenomenology between these close encounter experiences and some very, very old spiritual literature that is precise to a very fine and surprising degree.
Well, yeah, and it is. I think just to round out that account, you're right about those golden symbols which accompanied those movies. He did not have any particular sense of what they meant, but that they were significant. And this points to is this idea of some sort of a deeper language um, available to our deeper selves or our higher consciousness in some way. In terms of the relationship between the phenomenon and our religions, well, as you know, is that it is a sort of a common idea is that the extraterrestrials themselves have engineered and shaped our religions. I think it was that Jimmy Carter himself, when he came into power, he made a very determined effort to try and find the truth of what was occurring. He had and supposedly he was shared the conclusions of the working group which managing the subject, and they reported to him is that Jesus himself was an engineered being or a hybrid creature. He was, deliberately inserted into our culture in order to, promulgate the what would become Christianity. Um, I think you can also find is that there are a number of contentious accounts that would say that the translations of the Bible that we accept as authoritative are in fact a gross misrepresentation of what the earliest known documents would say. What the argument is that what is being said there is reads much more like an account of an extraterrestrial presence here on the earth, which engineered us, and with a view that we would evolve in some particular fashion. Again, to come back to the idea of the angels, it's good to point out that the report don't fear us, but it's also interesting is the number of times when they are confused for men. They are taken as human beings. So I think it is in the account of Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance, where the angels enter Sodom and they are threatened by the men there who want to rape them. They are they speak to Lot and to his wife, I believe, but all the time they're taken to be human beings. And even Jesus in his resurrected form, he's confused for a human as well. So when he meets some of his apostles, I think it's outside Jerusalem, they take him to be a foreigner, they take him to be a stranger, but critically a man. So we have this, you have these sort of questions which seem to ask themselves about our various biblical accounts. And as you mentioned, you can see these accounts in other traditions. That it points to the possibility that if there was a full disclosure of the extraterrestrial presence and there was some sort of communication with them, it would demand a profound reworking of our religious traditions to not least with the view of eliminating error, inserting accuracy, and dissolving unneeded ambiguity.
Yeah. So to bring all this full circle, maybe we could try to address in summation what is the purpose of these teachings.
Well, I think it is, when we look at it, I think it's useful to actually sort of just define how the teachings are taught. And there are a number of avenues and a number of modes. There's a direct and an indirect mode. Let's start with the latter. The indirect mode is the teaching given by their presence and manner and approach. It's not codified, it's not necessarily translatable. But you find that if you troll your way through the literature and the accounts given, is that invariably people will comment on their presence and manner. We've already mentioned the sheer power of their consciousness, how that consciousness in a way can envelop or enfold ours, can penetrate ours. We need note that many people have reported that there was, to use the analogy used, was with rape, this idea that their being was invaded just by the power of their consciousness. But on the much more benign side of that, many report that the beings they encountered were enormously compassionate, that they were warm and caring in some way, that they meant well. People often report feeling love. They said it's like meeting an old friend or a brother or something. So there is that, and um, this is comparable. I think here of Wilbur's advice on how to find a spiritual teacher, how to find a guru. He said, well, it's simple. You fall in love. Whoever you fall in love with can serve as your teacher. So in a way, this sort of demonstration of compassion, care, a loving presence there is a teaching there, which again, like our discussion of the images for about our condition here on Earth, they do operate on the subconscious. It's not as if people are would daily review their experience, but these things do leave a mark. Um, Also, we have to look at that there is the sort of the indirect general influence that comes through. As I said, the religious traditions we looked it mentions Gurdjieff, Sajjan, Mormonism, is that there is possibility there, as these people report, is that there's been an ET teaching given to people within those traditions, which has become formalized and codified and is translatable. Also, alongside that, we have to take into account is that we have an undetected influence. In other words, there's an extraterrestrial influence on all of our religion, on religious teachings in general, and spiritual teachings in general, and that would certainly be within their power, as far as we can know. This just generally requires the influencing of the subconscious. That is by its nature sort of ambiguous. It's hard to define, and the questions there I think will only ever be answered once we have open contact with extraterrestrials who are willing to fully explain that there. And included in this area of undetected teaching is there are any number of people who can report meetings with mysterious people, impressive strangers. As the Bible says, beware meeting angels unaware. So we don't know to what extent people have been helped, been pointed in the right direction by extraterrestrials in a thoroughly undeclared and hidden manner. Um, More directly, though, we can see that there have been teachings given to individuals. People are told to do certain things, and this is very much different on a case by case basis. One instance in particular I think of is that there was a Brazilian farmer told that at this stage for human beings, the only thing worthwhile them doing is engaging in energetic development. Um, There, the number of lessons are really as large as the number of contactees. And then I suppose the last sort of particular form of teaching would be sort of the general teachings given by people such as Billy Meyer, who's written a number of books. You have the Umo case in Spain, where there was a whole quasi Bible given. But as we mentioned earlier, that is very much unrepresentative of the phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think that all makes a great deal of sense. And given that these beings manifest a type of consciousness that is not limited by space time and dimensionality in the ways that ours is, it suggests that they'd be able to operate at a level of subtlety that is hard for us to detect, and that they could be able to engineer the sort of emergent cultural consequences of the ideas and perspectives that they seed with a great deal of subtlety. And I mean, it goes back to what you said earlier. That quote from the Tao Te Ching. When the master's best work is done, the people say, "We did it ourselves." And that's part and parcel, of the theme we discussed, where the concern for our cultural integrity and our own historical momentum. And it's a very subtle thread, we can only sort of identify the broad outlines of it, but it's definitely there. And hopefully we'll be able to continue, if we continue contemplating and integrating these messages, it will help us reach a more bright and prosperous human future.
Well, yeah, it does then bring you to the question of like, what is the purpose of these teachings? Like, why make this particular effort? Um, and a number of ideas present themselves. If we find that the heart of this subject ultimately is the consciousness and the human development of consciousness, we may find, as I said, a very real point of commonality between us and them. If we begin to conceive our own existence as an evolutionary process, then we may be able to situate them as um, present in a comparable process, albeit more advanced. Then their degree of difference will naturally decline, if not collapse, in our own mind. This will also have the byproduct of reducing interhuman dispute and difference and idea of difference amongst various groups in the forms of fear, tribalism, and aggression itself may decline in very obvious and socially useful ways. Um, Alongside that, too, you'd have to imagine if we are being introduced into a greater uh, part of reality or of our idea of reality grows, then with that, you would have to assume is that our science will become more sophisticated and more reflective of the actualities of reality itself. With that technological development, you can only assume would proceed in an evolutionary way, that we become more technologically adept with a superior science that may be particularly critical at the historical context in the historical context we find ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think with spirituality, a lot of it comes down to the problems of identification and the process of disidentification from one's own personal ego, from one's, class, nationality, so on and so forth. All these artificial constructs of identity. And part of the basis of human tribalism uh, are the imperatives bequeathed to us by natural selection, that we should prioritize ourselves and the bearers of our genes. And that's sort of gotten culturally, systemically extended into those other beings who have the same ideological markers, and we're destroying our own lives and our collective existence with the us versus them mentality. And these beings are sort of inviting us into a perspective where we're not identified with our own particular and temporally very finite and very constricted aims, um, but we're identified with our whole ecosystem, because a lot of this contact is about the life of the earth. But beyond that, identified with the overall sweep of consciousness throughout the universe. Uh, and when we do find that commonality between us and them, uh, I think that it will take us to a point of view and a mode of being uh, that's going to be essential to our survival. Einstein famously said that no problem can be solved from within the level of consciousness that created it. And, Wilbur maintains that every phase in the development of civilization has been the expression of the level of consciousness that was current at that time. And at each successive phase has resulted from overcoming the limitations and the contradictions in consciousness that existed in that period. So it may very well be that the communications we are getting from these beings is giving us just the impetus we need to reach another perspective, and through that perspective, to create another world.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that when if these beings in all their variety, in all their diversity, rather, they seem to demonstrate comparable states and levels of consciousness that's suggestive of the idea that they've experienced comparable historical processes. It may well be is that our current civilizational juncture is one that they too have faced, that the problems we now experience are ones that they too have traversed. Um, it's that is an interesting point that suggests itself may also point to something else though, and that is that in our world only those cultures and groups who arrive at some higher perspectives are the groups that will survive the historical processes that are currently unfolding.
Yeah. So I guess we're going to have to see. Humanity is very clearly on the brink of any number of critical thresholds. And it doesn't seem like these beings are going to save us from ourselves. So we'll see how well the lesson is integrated and put into practice.
And I think that's maybe an excellent point on which to conclude that in all these communications, we find very little scientific information. We find very little assistance with particular technological development. There are claims that such is occurring within the context of ET governmental joint activity, but there's very little detail even in those accounts. I think there is nothing to suggest that there will be an extraterrestrial intervention to save us from ourselves. After all, there have been staggering massacres have occurred on this planet without intervention. And even the sorts of activities which they have claimed are especially dangerous and injurious to other worlds, such as atomic explosions, those warnings have been given since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nonetheless, there have been no steps taken to prevent atomic explosions. Notably, since those two atomic explosions in 1945, there have been 2,000 atomic slash nuclear explosions on Earth.
That's a staggering number.
Hmm. It is. And it is interesting to consider when it's juxtaposed against the idea that people have been told is that we don't understand what we're doing to other worlds in doing this. Um, but yeah, I don't think we'll be saved. We'll save ourselves.